There we go, 2 songs of testimony together. Since Jesus came into my heart, I've been changed. I hope that's your testimony today. I don't know if you've ever noticed in your life, but it's the small things that make the biggest difference. If you want to make a change in your life, if you want to be changed, if you want to transform, then it doesn't happen in one big stride. My testimony this morning is that standing here and saying, I want to lose weight, will not lose me weight. If only all you had to do was to say, I want to lose weight, and the weight dropped off you, we'd be all right, wouldn't we? Or if you, if you said, I want to drive, it wouldn't be enough just to get in the car and start driving. You've got to take those small steps. If you want to lose weight, then you need to eat better, you need to exercise, you need to stop any bad behaviours. If you want to learn to drive, you need to learn how a car works and learn your theory as well, learn how the rules of the road and all of that kind of stuff. It's the small steps that lead to the larger goal. And when it comes to our holiness, when it comes to our discipleship, our spiritual maturity, small groups can make a big difference. Small groups can help us take those steps towards holiness, to being more like Christ. Peter opens that passage that we heard from earlier, and you might want to turn back to it in your Bibles. And I hope that when you came in, you picked up a set of message notes, which unfortunately I didn't spot until I printed, actually say worship sheet at the top. Next week they will say message notes. And that will help you as we go through this message. And it's got some questions that you might want to reflect on if you had a small group in your small group, or you might want to reflect over it over lunch. We can reflect over it at the core picnic if you like, and some prayer subjects for this week. But as we turn back to that passage from 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 1 to 11, Peter starts that passage in the first verse by saying, so then, since Christ suffered physical pain, you must arm yourselves with the same attitude he had and be ready to suffer too. For if you have suffered physically for Christ, you have finished with sin. The world still needs the Salvation Army. Do you believe that? Thank you, Aidan. The world still needs the Salvation Army. God still has a purpose for the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army was brought into existence to win the world for Jesus, and the world is not yet won for Jesus, so there must still be a purpose for the Salvation Army. And the Salvation Army, therefore, needs soldiers who are armed with the attitude of Christ. As Peter says, arm yourselves with the same attitude he had. This is one of those verses that should speak to Salvationists really easily, because it's written in military language. If the world still needs the Salvation Army, if God still has a purpose for the Salvation Army, then he needs soldiers, and the Salvation Army needs soldiers who are armed with that attitude of Christ. We need soldiers who are upright in heart. We need soldiers who are ready with the right words, as Gina said in her testimony, to the people, for the people that they meet. We need soldiers whose thoughts are controlled by the Spirit. Soldiers who are saved and sanctified from sin. Soldiers who are humble as Christ was humble. Soldiers who are passionate about winning the world for Jesus. Soldiers who are calm and even-tempered. Soldiers who are gracious to others. Soldiers who are ready to fight against injustice. Soldiers who are ready to love others with God's love. And Peter lays it out for us in black and white. He says, you have a black and white choice to make, a stark choice to make. In verse 2, he says, you won't spend the rest of your lives chasing your own desires, but you will be anxious to do the will of God. He says that's a stark choice. You can't do both. You can either give up chasing your own desires and live God's will out in your life, or you can forget about God's will and live out your own desires. What will we do? What's our answer to Peter's question? Do we continue to live in a sinful way, chasing our own desires? Or do we say, no, I'm going to live for you, God. I'm going to follow your will. And Peter goes on to expand on that and to explain what that means. And so in verse 3 he says, you've had enough in the past of the evil things that godless people enjoy, their immorality and lust, their feasting and drunkenness and wild parties, and their terrible worship of idols. Peter was painting a picture of what society was like at that time. That is a picture of Greco-Roman life that was morally out of control. The people, the Christians that Peter was writing to, knew that society was like that people lived for immorality and lust. They feasted and got drunk at wild parties, and they worshipped idols in terrible ways that we probably can't even imagine. If Peter was writing his letter today, I wonder what today's list would be. It might not be much different, to be honest. If we look around our culture today, it seems like anything goes. If you walk through one of our big cities at the weekend on a Saturday night, for example, or into the early hours of Sunday morning, you'll see they're filled with people who are drinking to excess. We know that drug use is on the rise. We can see fighting in the streets. We've seen what's happened in Plymouth in the last 48 hours or so. Sometimes it feels like society is breaking down and anything goes. But before we get on our moral high horses, we also have to realize that churches are not immune to this. Almost every week there appears to be a high-profile pastor who's asked to resign from his post for extramarital affairs or through abuse and assaults, aggressive behavior, and so on. Our churches have had to face up to the paedophilia that's happened over many years and abuse that's taken place, and the churches are not immune from that. I wonder what you think when you read that list in verse 3. The things that godless people enjoy, their immorality and lust, their feasting and drunkenness and wild parties, and their terrible worship of idols. I wonder if your first response is, well, I'm not involved in any of that. I kind of hope it is, if you're a Christian. We need to have a conversation afterwards if it's not. Immorality and lust, feasting and drunkenness and wild parties, and the terrible worship of idols. Maybe we're not involved in those kind of things, but what about other choices that we make? What about the entertainment choices that we make, the things that we look at on our TV screens or on our mobiles or our tablets? What about the financial choices that we make? What about going around and thinking that God must always be pleased with us because of the good things that we do? Or alternatively, going round and thinking God must always be displeased with me because of the failures that I have in my life. What about the fact that sometimes we're guilty of believing that we know what is in the Bible and what it says about a particular issue, particularly a controversial issue, but we haven't really studied it very deeply to know whether that's true or not? What about the fact that sometimes we're guilty of doing more than we are being still in God's presence and reflecting with him? What about the fact that sometimes we're judgmental of others? Or that we're too insular, we don't actually have that many non-Christian friends? This is not to make us feel bad, but simply to point out that although we may not find ourselves in that list in verse 3, we can all make choices every day that go against the will of God. So how do we arm ourselves, as Peter says, with Christ's attitude and choose God's will instead? I'm about to say something that's going to shock you. Okay, I'm giving you fair warning. You might want to sit up in your seat and make sure that your back is right against the back of the chair so you're not too shocked. How do we arm ourselves with Christ's attitude and choose God's will? Do you know it doesn't matter how many sermons you listen to? Is that a shock? Some of you are so shocked you can't even reply. It doesn't matter how many worship songs you sing. It doesn't matter how many meetings you attend. It doesn't matter how long you play your instrument for. It doesn't matter how many times you pick up the Bible to read it each day. It doesn't matter how many times you pray, and it doesn't matter how devoted you are to God, unless you connect with other people. Those things do matter, but only when you connect with other people. Let me give you an example. I could listen to 1,000 sermons on being patient. I could study the Bible to see all that it says about being patient. I could sing worship song after worship song about the fruit of the Spirit, which includes patience. I can go to meetings where patience is the theme. I can read my Bible, I can pray and ask God to help me be patient. But until I connect with someone else, that's all theory. My patience is never tested. Do you know I never get impatient when I'm on my own? We're only impatient with other people, aren't we? Or at least connected with them somehow. It might be that we're on our own, but we're thinking, but I need to get this done because I've got to go off and do this with someone else. Or I've got to get this sermon finished because people are going to expect me to stand up and give a sermon on Sunday. The patience isn't tested until we connect with others. That's why, as we said a couple of weeks ago when we were thinking about this, Christianity began in a group. It didn't begin with individuals, because the Christian life is grown in relationship with other people. Our spiritual maturity only comes when we are connected with others. But as I've said countless times over the last few weeks, you cannot connect deeply with the whole congregation. It's impossible, even in a group this size. Do you know, and again, I'm not being judgmental, this is just an example, I'm amazed by the number of people who've been in this corps for many years who, when I mention someone, say, I don't know who that is. Now, that's not being judgmental, that's because you cannot know 90 people. It's impossible to connect with them. We can only truly know and be truly known by a few people. As we said a couple of weeks ago, Jesus understood that. That's why he brought together a group of 12 to learn from him, to be his disciples, his apostles. And actually, he had a small group of 3. And Peter understands this too. If you look back at that passage that we looked at, Peter talks about arming ourselves with the attitude of Christ, not doing the things that godless people do. And then he goes on to verses 8 and 9, which at first glance seem totally disconnected from the rest of the passage. He says, most important of all, continue to show deep love for each other, for love covers a multitude of sins. Cheerfully share your home with those who need a meal or a place to stay. What on earth has that got to do with arming ourselves with the attitude of Christ? It seems disconnected. But Peter obviously didn't disconnect it, because he begins that verse 8 with most important of all. It is connected somehow, at least in Peter's mind. How is it connected? Well, how do we arm ourselves with Christ's attitude? How do we reject our own desires and accept God's will for our life? How can we be earnest and disciplined in our prayers? Peter says it's by sharing deep love with each other and sharing our homes together. When we meet in a small group in our homes for fellowship and for praying together and for discussing the Bible together, small groups can help us on the road to spiritual maturity and holiness. Our small group of Christian friends can help us by speaking truth into our lives. As we share our lives more deeply with the people who care and love us and want to connect with us deeply, we can grow in holiness and spiritual maturity. Our small group of Christian friends can help us by holding us accountable. It's our small group of Christian friends who are going to be the ones who nudge us and say, hang on a minute, I think you might be going the wrong way. They can encourage us. They can remind us that what we said we were going to do about something. And they do that not because they're judgmental and they like picking up the things that are wrong, but because they love and deeply care for us. You said you were going to do this, and I can see how that would be good in your life and how it would aid your holiness and your spiritual maturity. What are you doing to do what you said you were going to do? It's our small group of Christian friends who are going to care for us in a crisis. We're all going to face difficulties and problems at some time. And it's your small group that's going to be there for you. They're the ones who are going to phone and text you and say, how are you doing? They're the ones who are going to check in on you and say, is there anything that we can do for you? And as I alluded to a little earlier, it's your small group that's going to test your spiritual fruit. If you want to test your love, your joy, your peace, your patience, your kindness, your goodness, your faithfulness, your gentleness, and your self-control, then get with a small group because they're going to test it for you. Because however much you love and care for each other, however good Christians you are when you get together, there will be times when someone winds you up. Some of you obviously testify to that, I can hear. You know, you're going to get together and maybe that person's had a bad week, or maybe you've had a bad week, or maybe they take up a completely ridiculous position over something that you're discussing, or perhaps they dominate the prayer time with a 10-minute prayer, which means that nobody else can pray, or maybe they complain about the strength of the tea. I don't know. All sorts of different things that are going to test your spiritual fruit. Our spiritual fruit is only tested when we are connected together. And a small group gives us the opportunity to choose to cover a multitude of sins with our love for each other. And so I simply say to you, whether you're in the hall today or whether you're watching online, find some friends, find some Christian friends who you'd like to deepen your relationship with in a small group. That's all you need to do. Then you just need to decide when you're going to meet, what day of the week. We've freed up Sunday evenings, and I guess that most small groups may meet on Sunday evening, but you can meet at another time. How often you're going to meet? My suggestion is that we do it weekly so that we get into the rhythm, and I'm going to produce message notes each week, so we've got something to look at if you want to do that. But it doesn't have to be every week. You might say, we can only manage once a month or fortnightly or whatever. You can decide that amongst yourselves. And then just sign up on the notice board so we know which groups are meeting, or contact Patrick and let him know instead. Be proactive about it. Okay? I'm not going to organise it for you. You need to organise it amongst yourselves. And it won't just happen like standing up and saying, I want to lose weight, and then hoping the weight's going to drop off. Just saying, oh yeah, I'd like to be in a small group isn't going to get us anywhere. We actually have to organise ourselves into those small groups. We've been talking about it for what seems like weeks now. Now's the time that we actually need to take action to do that, and we will focus on that more next Sunday. But you can get ahead of the game and sort it out this week. Be aware that as you think about it, Satan will try to tempt you to say no. He'll put all sorts of barriers up. Can't find a time when we're going to meet. Don't know how we're going to fit in everybody's house if we have a group that's big. I've got other stuff that I've been doing over the last 18 months now, and I don't really want to give that up. All sorts of reasons why we shouldn't meet as a small group. But we're talking about meeting together and arming ourselves with Jesus' attitude and saying yes to God's will. Surely that's the most important thing that we can do together. But Satan doesn't like that, so he's going to try and persuade us otherwise. Arm yourself against his attacks. Pray about it, as I'm sure you have been doing. Pray that we'll all make the right choices and get involved. Pray for those deep, loving connections between us. Pray that we'll find the time. Pray that the small groups will begin to make a difference and will begin to change and transform, and our holiness will grow as a result, and we will be a more effective army in the days to come because we've armed ourselves with the attitude of Christ.